On April Fool's Day of last year, Adult Swim unveiled the pilot of Frowning Friends, which would end up becoming the premiere episode of the first season that aired earlier this year. In this video, I'm going to be reviewing all 8 episodes, giving each a score, and then talking about the season in general at the end. Anyway, let's go ahead and get into every episode of Frowning Friends Season 1 reviewed. Episode 1. Desmond's Big Day Out. A small company dedicated to bringing happiness to the world receives a simple request to help a woman's happy son smile again. The pilot opens with Pim, Charlie, Alan, and Gleb more or less watching the TV. This joke pays off a lot better towards the end of the episode, but I really quickly just want to highlight how well our main duo is characterized here. It's not overly in your face or anything, but it works really well to highlight the more chill and more eccentric partner. The first truly funny joke of the episode comes from the boss though. The censorship doesn't really hinder the comedic value at all, and the lack of music along with lack of any real background makes it a super memorable scene. However, it's not the most memorable scene, as that has to go to the uncovering of Desmond. Every part of the scene is fantastic, from the animation of Pim's reaction to the sound design of cutting out the music when it cuts to Pim and Charlie. It's just great. I even think that making Charlie actually able to diffuse the situation is a nice little bit of characterization for him. Anyway, this takes us to Alan's subplot, which is just not as interesting. Alan at this point in the show's 4-minute lifespan isn't really interesting enough to carry the scene, and the strange man in the walls isn't funny enough to justify it either. Back to the good stuff, Pim's family is nothing short of hilarious, as each member of the family gets a funny line or two. Desmond holding the gun to his head adds comedy to every scene he's in too. Daveland leans a little bit too heavily on its core joke, but Pim getting broken by Desmond's existential questioning is animated fantastically well, and the complete stiffness of Pim for the rest of the episode works comedically. Alan getting crucified is a great sudden cut, and the realization that murdering Bibbles is exactly what Desmond needed, followed by the complete change of appearance, is a fantastic way to end the episode. The ending gag is really take it or leave it for me, and is definitely the biggest reminder of this episode's beginnings as an individual pilot. Overall, this pilot is just great. The Alan stuff in the middle holds it back a bit, but as an introduction to our main 2 characters, it works really well. It sets the world nicely too, and I genuinely found most of the jokes to be fantastic. Great pilot, and it's not hard to see why I got picked up for more. Episode 2. Mr. Frog. After beloved frog celebrity Mr. Frog gets into hot frog water, Pim and Charlie are tasked with helping the frog get things back on frog track. As you can tell, I did not write this synopsis. Anyway, this episode is first of the series to have a live-action frame story for the episode. Besides the gag at the end though, this one really doesn't add much at all. The setup for this one's actually pretty similar to the pilot, both beginning with the gang watching television. This episode actually has one more thing in common with the pilot, being the only 2 episodes this season to have real subplots. It definitely feels like the plan was to have either a Glep or Alan subplot in each episode, and they ended up scrapping that down the line. Anyway, this subplot actually kicks off the episode with a really fun scene about casting the new Mr. Frog. The subplot in general is just fantastic, giving the episode a secondary message about executives misunderstanding the appeal of their shows. Glep works best in this kind of role, although it's hard to see how they would do another Glep subplot without majorly retreading over this one. Anyway, that's a problem for season 2, as the main plot also begins on a really high note. The double straight man angle with Pim and Charlie trying to contain Mr. Frog works really well. It's fun to see them both react to Mr. Frog's atrocities throughout this episode, and how each one plans to help him. The scenes in this section range from great, like Charlie shooting guns with Mr. Frog, to fantastic, like the Jimmy Fallon scene. I honestly did not think the show would go this far, but the daggers directed towards this Tonight Show are hilarious to watch. And so is Mr. Frog saying some kind of horrific slur on air. The final scene connects the subplots really well, and gives great conclusions to both. The episode really builds up Rex being such a horrible person that Mr. Frog devouring him is as satisfying to the audience of the show as it is to the audience to the show. The joke at the end is my favorite of the episode too.
Was that man dying at full, Charlie?
I don't know, Pim. I don't know.
Overall, this one continues the momentum from the pilot nearly 2 years later. It's funnier, more consistent, and better animated too. Also, just looking at the other 6 episodes this season, I think it's one of the better options to start off the actual run of the show with. So yeah, this episode is fantastic. It sets the bar high for the rest of the season, and hopefully the series. Episode 3, Shrimp's Odyssey. When a shrimp calls the hotline after being dumped by his true love, Shrimpina, Pim and Charlie have very different ideas about how to handle the situation. After the pretty funny Swarmu bit, we get another fantastic bit to start the episode. Pim accidentally eating worms because he can't see is mainly used to set up the ending gag, while also just being a really funny joke by itself. The boss running to grab the phone has some really clever shots to it, as this episode sets up what is likely the most basic setup of the season. Someone calls in who actually needs cheering up. Despite this being the premise of the show, this only happens about half the time, so it doesn't really feel stale throughout this first season. Anyway, one of my favorite parts about this series is the background gags, and one of the best examples of this has to be the guy getting his head regressively stomped in during the entire conversation with Shrimp. Shrimp definitely could have gotten old, but by splitting the plots, they managed to keep that from occurring. The stereotype is obviously a bit cliche, but they still make it work this episode. episode. Speaking of splitting the plots, I like how this characterizes Pym and Charlie by having them decide to tackle this issue differently. Each method matches the character and gives the episode a pretty solid structure. Anyway, before getting to the conversation with the barista, no review of this episode would be complete without giving props to this very internety yet very funny reference.
Number 15. Could I get the number 15?
The writing during the cafe doesn't really seem that impressive until after you watch the episode and you know the twist, but it's funny and quick and ends with a pretty great gag. Speaking of great jokes, I really want to shout out this bit after Shrimp changes his clothes.
You look like you're about to tell your friend not to come to school tomorrow, man.
Shrimp getting his life back together is filled with some fantastic gags besides this one, like Charlie referring to himself as an alpha male, but I really want to talk about the montage of Pym's future. This is one of those rare gags that gets funnier because of its length, and the attention to detail while drawing elderly versions of Pym and his friends is fantastic. Despite all these exceptional gags, the episode somehow peaks at the disco. Pym deciding to let Shrimp have Shrimpina is arguably the most serious moment of the show so far, so having it immediately juxtaposed with the reveal of Jennifer's identity works fantastically well. Jennifer still falling for Shrimp is a bit too random, but I really like the callback to Pym's eye problems from the beginning of the episode. My favorite line at the end of this episode has to be Pym referring to Shrimpina not being a shrimp as a
quirky, like you didn't expect she was going to be a human thing.
Finally, Smormu just appearing at the end while Pym is just standing there shocked ends the episode on a perfect note. Overall, another great one. It's hard to explain in a way that differs from the last episode, but it's just a clever plot filled with funny visual and verbal gags. A fantastic early run for the series. Episode 4, a silly Halloween special. Pym ventures into the forest across the road to fetch firewood for the office Halloween party. 4 episodes into the series, and we already have a format-breaking one. Just like Mr. Frog, this one also has a live-action frame story, this one being much funnier than the former. Most of the gags of this one come at the end, but the mix-up of the horrors of reality is one of my favorite subtle jokes of the season. Something that is done in nearly every episode that's done best here is the episode starting with the Smiling Friends in their workroom. This scene varies a bit from episode to episode, but it almost always vaguely sets up the ending gag, this time through Charlie's explanation of why he doesn't wear a costume. I really love these scenes as they give a sense of stability to this otherwise completely unhinged show. The costume design for this episode is also fantastic, with the bosses and Allens being especially hilarious. Pym's cowboy getup is also a great look for the character, and even serves some thematic importance later in the episode. Obviously, the title and boss's warning indicate this episode is not going to be a silly Halloween special, but it actually leans into non-comedic horror more than I really thought that it would. Pym is great this episode, really fulfilling that terrified horror movie protagonist role. The animation to depict just how desperate he is once it starts to rain is fantastic, and the animation in general just looks impeccable. The cabin has some of the only gags in the middle part of the episode, and the boat ride provides one of my favorite shots of the season. It's at this point where we finally get a look at the forest demon, and yeah, the mixed animation works really well to give him an otherworldly look. For a comedy show, the chase scene is also really well choreographed, especially when he jumps in front of the moon and chases Pym down the hallway. Of course, this episode isn't going to end on a serious note, and the gag they choose to end on is pretty funny, albeit likely a bit controversial. I like the decision not to include Pym, Alan, Charlie, or Charlie's girlfriend in the carnage, as it keeps them relatively grounded for the series. Pym's look of horror while all this is occurring is fantastic too, just like the pilot. Overall, this Pym-centric episode is, again, fantastic. Instead of following the last 2 great episodes and just being really funny, this episode has comedic opening and ending scenes and some genuinely terrific horror and animation in the middle. I know I sound like a broken record at this point, but this episode is yet another almost flawless one. Episode 5, Who Violently Murdered Simon S. Salty? The life of famous food tycoon Simon S. Salty and investigating while he was brutally murdered in his own restaurant. This episode is one of the only ones in the series to not open with the 4 smiling friends at work. Still, there is definitely a similar vibe to this calm opening style as Pym and Charlie discuss the movie they just saw. This episode is also the first in the series to feature Pym and Charlie outside of work, although this quickly changes once they get to Salty's. The fake ads for Salty's is hilarious and is definitely the most Adult Swim thing in this Adult Swim show. The obviously guilty ketchup referring to Mr. Salty's iconic 7 p.m. nap is funny too, and the cartoon knife stabbed into the live-action Simon is just a very amusing sight. This is where arguably for the first time since the pilot, the episode and the series goes a bit downhill. Don't get me wrong, some of the gags are still ridiculously funny, like Pym being horrified by the drink guy or Charlie being seduced by the mustard packet, but in general, the interrogations are a bit repetitive. The cycle of question, punchline, reaction gets a bit annoying by the time they wrap it up. However, the episode definitely begins to pick up speed again once they find the secret room. The dying sentry egg is a great continuation of the mascot gag, and the slow reveal that every single mascot killed Simon in one way or another is done really well. I especially especially like Charlie trying to explain that just because they try to kill a dead man doesn't mean they get to go free, and the sitcom-esque ending to the episode really juxtaposes the murder mystery theme well. Also, for the first time, this episode features a post-credit scene. It's actually my favorite scene in the episode, with Alan and Glep joining our main two characters in China to bury the Century Egg. Actually going to China to bury him is a nice twist, and the gruesome ending gag, while incredibly easy to see coming, ends the episode on a hilarious note. Overall, this episode can only be considered subpar when compared to others in this show. The sequence in the middle being a little bit slow barely holds the episode back, as it's filled with great gag characters and the best use of live action in the show. While perhaps not as strong as the two episodes that came before it, this one still has great jokes, moments, and characters. Episode 6, Enchanted Forest. Pim and Charlie are beckoned into the mysterious Enchanted Forest by a princess and encounter all sorts of insane toon characters along their journey. This episode's a bit strange, really. The opening doesn't feature the boss getting a call or the smiling friends uncovering something. Instead, with a functionally similar fairy thing, the episode's troubles begin almost immediately after, as they can't decide whether or not they're doing a fantasy RPG parody, as evidenced by the various fetch quest jokes, especially during the beginning, or a Lord of the Rings parody, as seen through Mip and later Gollum Pim. Unfortunately, while both segments have clever gags and great jokes, neither really commits very well. Pim's jealousy of Mip doesn't really get to build up either, and more or less seems like it just spawns to give the episode some kind of plot. Similarly, the rage from Pim is somewhat out of character and just feels kinda weird. The backgrounds and other visuals look fantastic in this episode though. From the odd character designs to the vibrant Enchanted Forest, this episode is arguably the best looking in the show. Unfortunately, the storytelling and jokes in this episode take a bit of a nosedive, as seen best by Mip's death. Pim going full Gollum and participating in the murder of someone is funny in concept, but execution-wise is pretty weak in this one. Pim's death is just really weirdly written. Like, Charlie seems to not really care at all, and even Mip himself seems pretty neutral about it. Luckily, after this point, the episode does begin to pick up a bit. I liked both the gags of Mip's death being demonic and the reveal that Mip was the reason the princess couldn't smile. I was also pleasantly surprised when they didn't actually kill off the princess. We get another post-credit scenes too, although this one isn't really as funny as the last one. Overall, while there is definitely plenty to like about this episode, it's definitely my least favorite one yet. The characterization seems off this episode, which while that would be expected from a first season, it's odd when the first 5 are so solid. Pair that with the least funny episode of these 8, and even if there are some clever references and beautiful backgrounds, this one still underwhelms. Episode 7, Frowning Friends. A rival business moves across the street, much to the boss's dismay. If it wasn't for the excellence of the next episode, I would say that this one would have made the perfect season finale. From the first scene, it seems like the show almost parodying itself, something that becomes most apparent once the Frowning Friends enter the episode. The complete opposite visuals work really well, and the names are fantastic too. I like how if the pilot was Alan's episode and Mr. Frog was Glep's, then this one is definitely the boss's. Watching him slowly break down from the arrival of the Frowning Friends is fantastic, and until he comes back into the episode at the end, it actually goes a bit downhill. It's honestly kind of strange. Charlie calls out just how cliche the Frowning Friends are, just for the show to continue using that cliche for another minute or two without doing anything interesting with it. Anyway, luckily this gap in quality is short-lived as we get right back to the boss. The boss going through hallucinations before going completely commando is a hilarious scene, and it's great watching him make his way to the top of the Frowning Friends HQ. Alan and Glep switching sides because of a better 401k is a pretty funny gag, although if/when they want to eventually do a scene about how close the 4 smiling friends are, this scene won't exactly age well. But anyway, the highlight of the episode is definitely Grimm immediately breaking down as soon as his life is threatened. The entire scene actually ends the episode thematically pretty well. I really like how it resolves with the Frowning Friends by allowing the boss to remember why he operates the smiling counterpart. I am, however, kind of split on the joke ending. On one hand, having the Renaissance men come and kill Grimm and Gnarly kind of ruins the perfect thematic ending, getting rid of one of the only few serious-ish moments of the season. On the other hand, the scene is just really hilarious. From the horrified boss to Charlie and Pim arguing over Charlie's knowledge of the Renaissance men, this scene is ridiculously funny. Overall, this episode's pretty good. I think it's at the right spot in the season, and it starts and ends well. While a slightly slow middle section does hold it back, it still has memorable jokes, moments, and characters. Episode 8, Charlie dies and doesn't come back. Charlie actually dies for real. The office setup for this episode is one of my favorites from the season. The boss referring to himself as your favorite character, Charlie playing Rust, and Pim's reaction to A Christmas Miracle all make for great elements of this first scene. The conversation between Charlie and Pim as they walk towards the former's demise is probably the longest conversation in the show without something wacky happening in the middle. And yeah, despite being light on jokes, this scene works really well. The callbacks to the pilot are great, and Pim explaining how Charlie has lost his mojo works really well. I definitely felt like this season was building up to some kind of character character moment at the end, and while I thought it was going to be making Pym lose his optimism, something they might do in season 2, it's actually Charlie needing to get invested again and making people smile. Charlie's death being so sudden and gruesome is fantastic, and the fake out in the Hell Cave is hilarious too. Charlie finding his grandmother in hell just because of a single word makes for an amusing moment, and I like the montage of Charlie making his way through hell. The music being ridiculously corny is terrific too.
Well, it's Christmas in H-E-double-L.
The visuals to bring this cartoony but horrific version of hell to life work really well. Of course though, the most memorable element of this episode has to be his depiction of Satan as a Rust-playing Discord user. Satan's portrayal as a demonic, sadistic, Rust-playing loser parallels Charlie, and it allows the episode so many options comedically, most of which the episode capitalizes on. I mean, just the awkward interaction with the food delivery guy is great, and Satan deciding to still torture Charlie for eternity works really well for some dark humor. Satan finally enjoying torturing again parallels Charlie enjoying helping people again, and the God gag, while short, is still terrific. The boss's eulogy is one of its funniest moments in the series, and I love everyone's outfits and reactions when a naked Charlie drops from the sky. Pym not caring at all about his sudden appearance or lack of clothing fits the character well, and ends the season on a surprising but very satisfying wholesome note. Well, ends the season besides the funniest line of the episode, and perhaps the season as well.
Hell is actually real, and Christianity was right all along. Sorry.
Overall, these 11 minutes work really well as an episode, and even better as a season finale. In general, this episode is loaded with hilarious gags, genuine character moments, and memorable events throughout. While not changing the status quo at all for the next season, they really knocked it out of the park with this one. And since the season's pretty short, here's the season overview. To start off with, as I mentioned pretty much throughout the entirety of the review, the show is just ridiculously and consistently hilarious. The jokes come in every form you can think of and as fast as you can possibly process them. While not every single joke works, they come out fast enough they don't even have time to focus on the bad ones. Speaking of consistency, this is honestly one of the most consistently great first seasons of cartoon that I have ever seen. The show wastes no time getting into the fantastic episodes, and I would call 7 of these first 8 episodes great. The characters all work together fantastically well, and the show is animated tremendously well, with every episode taking place in at least one great environment with great backgrounds and even better background gags. The premise of the show is just so fantastic that each plot works so well, and even when it breaks off from it, like the Halloween episode, the show still adapts and creates an entertaining product. The creative decision to limit the season to 8 episodes seems like a bad choice, but it means that every single plotline shows tremendous promise, and with one exception, they all deliver. It's hard to find much else to say about the season when I really don't have any significant criticisms. It's just terrific through and through. Anyway, enough dancing around it, I'm giving the season a 9 out of 10. Picking a least favorite of the season was easy, with the Enchanted Forest being the only one this season I didn't really mind for. But the other choice for favorite was much more difficult, but I eventually settled on Charlie dies and doesn't come back. Almost every episode is hilarious, but this one also has a strong character arc at its core, leading me to pick it as my top episode. Anyway, if you want to hear more updates on the channel, check out my Twitter. Otherwise, this has been Abel Samuel, and whenever it comes out, I'll see you for season 2. Thanks for watching.